The floor of the massive ferry violently drops to a 45-degree angle. Freezing ocean water begins smashing against the lower cabin window. Inside, hundreds of high school students are clinging to the slanted walls, terrified in the dark. But the ship's intercom is repeatedly broadcasting a chilling command. Do not move. Stay in your cabins. Obediently, the teenagers sit down on the slanted floor. They wait for a rescue that isn't coming. Why were they ordered to just sit there and die? South Korea is a nation deeply connected. Ferry travel is not a luxury. It is an incredibly common, everyday method of transportation. In April 2014, the Sewol Ferry was preparing for an overnight voyage from Incheon to the vacation island of Jeju. It was a massive, multi-level vessel. It was carrying 476 people. The vast majority of the passengers were teenagers. 325 students from Danwon High School were on board. They were laughing, taking selfies, and settling into their shared cabins for a highly anticipated class field trip. The atmosphere in the hallways was loud and completely celebratory, but beneath the steel deck, the ship was hiding a fatal, criminal secret. The Sewol was a floating disaster just waiting for a spark. The ferry company had illegally redesigned the ship. They added massive passenger cans to the upper decks to increase their profit, but adding that much structural weight to the top of a ship makes the vessel dangerously top-heavy. To offset the massive weight, safety regulations required the ship to carry hundreds of tons of liquid ballast water deep in the hull. The water acts as an anchor. It keeps the ship upright in rough seas. But the operators secretly drained that water. They emptied the ballast tanks so they could illegally pack more heavy cargo into the cargo hold. They crammed over 2,000 tons of cargo onto the ship. It was more than double the legal safety limit. And worse, the cargo was not properly tied down. Massive shipping containers and heavy vehicles were just sitting in the dark, barely secured by cheap ropes. The ship was perfectly balanced on a razor's edge. One sharp movement would bring the entire vessel down. On the morning of April 16th, the Sewol entered the Mangol Channel. It is a notoriously treacherous stretch of water. It is infamous for intense, swirling undercurrents and highly unpredictable tides. An inexperienced third mate was steering the massive vessel through the thick morning fog. Navigating the heavy current, she ordered a sharp, sudden turn to starboard. The physics of the top-heavy ship simply could not handle the violent momentum. Deep in the hull, the cheap ropes snapped. Massive shipping containers and heavy vehicles violently slid to one side of the ship. The deafening sound of grinding metal echoed through the lower decks. The weight shift was instant and catastrophic. The Sewol immediately rolled 15 degrees to port. It never recovered. Up in the passenger cabins, the sudden tilt threw teenagers violently against the walls. Heavy vending machines tipped over in the hallways, crushing the people standing beneath them. Luggage cascaded down the slanted floors like a violent avalanche. Panic immediately flooded the corridor. Students scrambled for their bright orange life jackets. They were completely unsure of what to do as the floor slanted violently beneath their feet. Some tried to climb toward the upper decks. Others braced themselves against the doorframes, waiting for an adult to tell them what was happening. Then the ship's intercom clicked on. A calm, highly authoritative voice echoed through the metal hallways. Do not move from your present locations. Staying where you are is safe. It was a direct order from the bridge. In South Korean culture, respect for authority and absolute obedience to elders is deeply ingrained. These were exceptionally good kids. They were raised to trust the adults in charge without question. So they listened. Hundreds of students sat down on the slick, slanted floors of their cabins. They trusted that a master rescue plan was already in motion. They pulled out their cell phones to record the chaos. The recovered digital evidence from these phones provides the most heartbreaking, intimate view of a disaster ever recorded in human history. In the early video, the teenagers are nervously joking. They complain about the extreme tilt. They compare the situation to the Titanic, entirely unaware of the absolute reality of their trap. The intercom repeats the command again and again. Please do not move. If you move, it is dangerous. The students obey. They stay perfectly still inside their designated rooms, but outside the ship, the ultimate betrayal was quietly unfolding. The captain and the senior crew were not coordinating a mass evacuation. They were not guiding the terrified children up to the open deck. They were not deploying the life rafts. They had completely abandoned the bridge. The captain, retreated to his private quarters. He took off his official uniform. He put on a casual sweater and his underwear, intentionally trying to blend in as a regular passenger. As the first Coast Guard rescue vessels arrived, the captain quietly slipped out a side door. He stepped directly onto a rescue. He left his sinking ship behind. He didn't even grab his radio to issue a final evacuation order. He entirely abandoned the 300 children locked inside the lower decks. With the captain gone, the ship was completely paralyzed. The Coast Guard vessels circled the sinking ferry, but they did not board the ship. They shouted through megaphone, rescuing the few passengers who had managed to climb out onto the exterior rails. They assumed an evacuation was already underway inside, but nobody went inside to tell the students the truth. Nobody told them the captain had already fled. They were left entirely in the dark. The tilt rapidly increased to 45 degrees, then 50, then 60. The physics of the interior completely shifted into a nightmare. Cabin doors that were once easy to open suddenly became heavy steel ceilings. Long, flat hallways transformed into deep, vertical shafts. Even if the students wanted to, they physically couldn't. They couldn't climb the slick, slanted floors. Gravity had permanently locked them inside their room. The cell phone videos track the exact, terrifying realization. The nervous laughter completely stops. The angle of the cameras shifts violently as the kids slide against the lower walls. The panic in their voices spikes. They look out the cabin windows and see the dark ocean rising above the glass. They realize the adults have lied to them. There is no rescue team coming down the hall. They are entirely on their own. The students begin to frantically text their parents on the mainland. The messages are absolutely devastating. Mom, I'm sending this now in case I don't get to say it later. I love you. The ship is tilted 60 degrees. Why isn't anyone coming? Dad, I can't walk. The hallway is straight up. One video captures a group of students desperately trying to break the reinforced cabin glass with a heavy metal chair. The window barely scratches. It was built to withstand the pressure of the deep ocean. It easily withstands the desperate strikes of a terrified teenager. Another video shows a boy crying, looking directly into the lens. He apologizes to his parents for everything he ever did wrong. He holds the camera with shaking hands, whispering into the microphone, I don't want to die. The students start taking off their own life jackets. They hand them to their friends who don't have one. They huddle together, holding hands in the freezing dark. The water begins to pour through the door frames. The intercom never issues an evacuation order. The machine simply shorts out as the salt water hits the electrical grid. The ship groans under the crushing weight of the ocean. It rolls completely onto its side. At 10:30 a.m., the final bulkheads breach. The massive Sewol Ferry completely capsizes. The massive steel hull flips entirely upside down. The bow of the ship points to the sky for a few brief hours, and then it slowly slips entirely beneath the dark waves. The silence that followed was deafening. On the mainland, the families of the students watched the news broadcast in absolute horror. Initial government reports were completely botched. The news anchors falsely claimed that all the students had been successfully rescued. The parents cheered. They hugged each other in the school gymnasium, only to have their hearts completely ripped out hours later when the brutal truth broke. There was no mass rescue. Their children were still trapped inside the sunken hull, 40 meters below the surface of the freezing ocean. The recovery operation was a grueling, agonizing nightmare. The currents in the Mangal Channel were so violent that professional rescue divers were repeatedly swept away. Visibility in the freezing water was less than a foot. Divers had to navigate the upside-down labyrinth of the ship completely blind. They had to feel their way along the walls, dragging heavy oxygen lines behind them. It was a claustrophobic, incredibly dangerous environment. The interior was filled with floating mattresses, scattered luggage, and sharp, twisted metal. Days later, they finally reached the passenger cabins. They used heavy hammers to shatter the thick underwater glass. What they found inside mentally broke the hardened diving team. The students were not scattered randomly through the ship. Because they followed the intercom orders, they were clustered tightly together. They were exactly where they were told to be. Dozens of bodies were found huddled in the dark, still wearing their bright orange life jackets. They had floated upward as the water filled the room, pressing heavily against the submerged. But the most haunting physical evidence was found on the bodies themselves. When the medical examiners processed the victim, they noted severe trauma to the students' hands. Their fingernails were entirely broken. Many were completely ripped away from the nail bed. Their fingertips were worn down to the bare bone. In their final desperate moments, when the freezing water finally hit their faces, the obedience broke. They realized nobody. They tried to claw their way through the heavy steel bulkhead. They tried to scratch through the reinforced glass with their bare hands. They fought the dark with absolutely everything they had. But the ship had already taken them too deep. Cases like this don't just break maritime law. They break the core of human trust. And if exposing the dark truth of survival is why you watch, subscribe to Evidence Zero. Because the aftermath of the Sewol disaster tore an entire country apart. The sheer scale of the tragedy completely paralyzed South Korea. The disaster ignited a massive wave of national fury. The public turned their absolute rage against the ferry operator, the Coast Guard, and the highest levels of the government. Massive crowds filled the streets of Seoul, holding yellow ribbons in the air. They demanded answers for the hundreds of children left to drown in the dark. The political fallout was completely unprecedented. The president of South Korea was eventually impeached, with the Sewol disaster serving as a massive catalyst for her absolute downfall. The captain who abandoned the children was dragged into a courtroom. He stood before the grieving parents, completely unable to look them in the eye. He was convicted of gross negligence and murder. He was sentenced to spend the rest of his natural life in a concrete cell. The ferry company executives were hunted down by authorities. The billionaire owner of the company went into hiding, launching a massive nationwide manhunt. He was later found dead in a remote plum orchard. It was a deeply mysterious end to a cowardly escape. But the ferry itself could not be left at the bottom of the ocean. 3 years after the disaster, the South Korean government launched an unprecedented engineering operation. They used massive marine cranes to pull the rusted, mud-filled hull from the sea. They brought the Sewol back to the surface. It now sits on a dry dock in a heavily guarded port. It is a twisted, decaying monument to extreme human greed and catastrophic cowardice. But prosecuting the guilty does not rewind the clock. It doesn't dry the freezing water from the digital videos. The parents still sleep with the final text messages saved on their phones. They live with the audio of their children begging for help from inside a sinking metal box. They followed the instructions. They trusted the voice, and they waited. The ocean didn't.